The door was already open when I pulled into the driveway. Not ajar the way it gets in summer, when the wood swells and the latch doesn't catch. Wide open. The kind of open that means someone wanted me to see inside before I even reached the porch. I sat in the car for a moment. My black dress was still damp at the collar from standing at the graveside in the October drizzle, and my feet ached from the funeral home heels I hadn't worn in years. I had just buried my father-in-law. I had just watched them lower Thomas Aldridge into the ground at Restwood Cemetery, while his son, my husband, stood 3 feet away from me and didn't once reach for my hand. I told myself the open door was an accident. I told myself a lot of things that afternoon. When I walked inside, they were already seated at the dining room table. My husband, Richard, his younger brother, Carter. A woman I recognized as Donna Friel, the family's estate attorney. I had met her once, briefly, at a Christmas party 6 years ago. She had shaken my hand and called me the nurse, and Richard had laughed like it was a compliment. And sitting slightly apart from the group, his arms crossed, was my stepson, Derek. I say stepson because that's what he was legally. Richard's son from his first marriage. But I had never once thought of him that way in the 16 years I had lived in this house. Richard looked up when I came in. He didn't stand. He didn't ask if I needed a glass of water. He said, "We've been waiting. Close the door." I was 62 years old. I had raised that man's child, kept that man's house, driven that man's father to chemotherapy 41 times over 3 years. I counted once, 41 Tuesdays. I closed the door. Donna Friel set a folder on the table and folded her hands on top of it with the practiced composure of someone who does this for a living. She explained that Thomas Aldridge had updated his will 18 months prior. She explained that the house I had lived in for 16 years, the house where I had painted the kitchen cabinets twice and planted the garden out back and sat up through 3 nights with a sick old man who was afraid of the dark, had been left solely to Richard and Carter in equal shares. My name was not mentioned. There was a separate document, she said, a letter of instruction. She slid it across the table toward me without making eye contact. "I am leaving Linda the sum of $15,000 in gratitude for her years of service to this family." Service. Richard was watching me read. Not with guilt. With something that looked more like relief, the way a person exhales when they've been holding their breath a long time. "We're going to need the house listed by spring," he said. "Carter and I agree it makes more sense to sell, so we're thinking you'd need to find something else by the end of January." It was October 14th. I set the letter down flat on the table. I smoothed it once with my palm, the way I used to smooth the sheets on Thomas's hospital bed. Old habit. "I'd like a copy of the full will," I said. Donna Friel said she would have one sent over. I picked up my purse. I walked to the hallway. I took my coat from the hook by the door, the hook I had installed myself, with a drill and a wall anchor, because Richard always said he'd get to it and never did. I put the coat on over my black dress. "Linda." It was Derek's voice. The only voice at that table that wavered even slightly. I looked at him. 26 years old, and he still had the same expression he'd had as a 10-year-old boy the first time I drove him to baseball practice because his father forgot, a little lost. A little like he was waiting for someone to tell him what the right thing was. "I'll call you," I said, and I left. "I want to tell you something about Richard's father, because you need to understand him to understand any of what came after. Thomas Aldridge was not an easy man. He was stubborn and set in his routines and had opinions about everything from the correct way to fold a newspaper to what time dinner ought to be served. He had never fully approved of me, not because I had done anything wrong, but because I had replaced a mental image he'd had of what his son's life should look like. His first daughter-in-law, Derek's mother, had been the country club type. Blonde, well-dressed, from the right kind of family. I was a nurse from Dayton who had worn the same winter coat for 6 years and had opinions of my own. For the first 2 years I was in this family, Thomas and I circled each other the way 2 cats in the same house eventually learned to share the couch without acknowledging it. Then, he was diagnosed. Non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, stage 3. He was 74 years old and had never spent a night in a hospital in his adult life, and the fear in him was something he couldn't quite cover over with the bluster he normally used for everything. I was the first person he called after he told Richard and Carter. Not because he liked me, because he knew what I was. I sat with him that afternoon in the sunroom while the light went flat and gray, and we didn't say much of anything. Before I left, he looked at me and said, "I don't suppose you'd be willing to help." I told him yes. I cut my hours at the hospital to part-time that same month. By the end of the year, I wasn't working at all. Richard told people his wife had retired early. He did not tell people that I was managing his father's medications, coordinating his care team, driving him to treatment twice a week, and sleeping with a monitor on my nightstand because Thomas had started having night episodes that frightened him. Thomas did not become easy. He was difficult and sometimes unkind and occasionally said things that I let pass because I understood where they were coming from. But somewhere in the second year, things shifted. He started leaving the crossword on the kitchen table for me in the mornings. He started asking my opinion about things he didn't have to ask about. Once, after a particularly bad round of treatment when he couldn't keep anything down and I had stayed the entire night and driven home at 5 in the morning to shower before Richard woke up, Thomas had taken my hand before I left and said, "You didn't have to do this." I told him I knew that. "Then why?" he said. I told him I thought he deserved to have someone in his corner. He didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he said, "I misjudged you." I told him it happened. We didn't talk about it again. But things were different after that. Quieter, in a good way. Richard noticed none of this. Richard was busy. Richard was always busy with something: the business, the travel, the dinners that required his presence, the golf that required his presence, the particular architecture of a life that had been built to require his constant presence everywhere except at home. Carter was worse. Carter lived 40 minutes away and visited his father approximately 4 times in 3 years. And each time he arrived, he would spend 20 minutes asking questions about Thomas's condition in a tone of deep concern before pivoting to discussions of the estate. I watched all of this, and I kept my mouth shut because it wasn't my place and because Thomas had not asked for my commentary. I drove him to his 41 Tuesdays, and I fixed his meals, and I watched television with him in the evenings when he didn't want to be alone, and I did not expect anything in return. That was my mistake, I suppose. Not the doing of it, the not expecting. After I left that dining room, I drove to my friend Patricia's house in Westerville and sat in her kitchen and drank 2 cups of coffee and told her everything. Patricia is 70 and has been my closest friend since we worked the same floor at Riverside Methodist in 1991, and she has the particular gift of listening without interrupting and without softening things that don't need to be softened. When I finished, she said, "Do you have a personal attorney?" I said I had never needed one. She said, "You need one now." I called a family law attorney the next morning. Her name was Andrea Marsh, and she had been recommended by Patricia's daughter, who worked in the courthouse. I sat across from Andrea in her office on 5th Avenue and explained the situation. She listened with her pen capped and her notepad closed, which I have since learned is a good sign. She asked me several questions. She asked how long I had been married. 21 years. She asked whether my name appeared on any joint accounts or property. It appeared on our joint checking account and the mortgage on the house in Dublin, where Richard and I actually lived, not Thomas's house, which had always been in Thomas's name alone. She asked whether I had contributed financially to Thomas's care in any documented way. I told her I had given up my nursing salary, which at my level would have been substantial, and had received nothing in compensation for 3 years of full-time caregiving. She nodded slowly and made a note. Then she asked if there was anything else I thought she should know. I told her about the envelope. Thomas had given it to me 6 weeks before he died. He had been having a better week, one of those stretches in late illness where the body seems to gather itself, where the person seems almost like themselves again, and you know better than to trust it, but you're grateful for it anyway. We had been sitting on the back porch in the late afternoon, which we sometimes did when the weather permitted, and he had reached into the pocket of his cardigan and taken out an envelope and set it on the table between us. It was a standard white envelope, sealed. My name was written on the front in his handwriting, careful, deliberate, the handwriting of a man who had been taught that penmanship mattered. "I'd like you to hold on to that," he said. I asked him what it was. "It's mine to give and yours to keep," he said, which was the most Thomas thing he could possibly have said, and so I folded it and put it in my purse without arguing. I told him I would keep it safe. He looked out at the yard for a while. Then he said, I made some decisions a long time ago that I didn't revisit often enough. You understand what I mean by that. I said I thought I did. You've been good to me, he said. Better than I made it easy to be. I want you to know I understand that. I did not tell anyone about the envelope. Not Richard. Not Derek. I put it in the cedar box I keep in the back of the closet in our bedroom, under some letters from my mother, and I did not open it. Even when Thomas died. Even when I stood at Restwood Cemetery in the October rain and watched them lower him down and felt, for the first time in a long time, genuinely alone in a crowd. Even then, I don't know exactly why I waited. Something in the way he had said it, "It's yours to keep," made me feel that opening it in grief, in the immediate wreckage of the day, was not what he had intended. So, I waited 3 days. I went to Patricia's. I contacted Andrea Marsh. I found a rental in Worthington, a small place, a ground floor unit with a decent kitchen, and I gave them a deposit from my own savings account, which I had maintained separately throughout my marriage because my mother had always told me a woman should have a name on an account that only she could reach. And then, on the third night, sitting alone at Patricia's kitchen table with a cup of tea gone cold beside me, I opened the envelope. There were 2 things inside. The first was a letter, 4 pages, handwritten on Thomas's personal stationery, the cream-colored paper with his initials at the top that he only used for things that mattered. I will tell you what it said, though I can only give you the shape of it because some of it belongs only to me. He apologized. That was the first thing. Not in a formal or distanced way, but directly and without hedging, the way apologies almost never come. He apologized for the years before the illness, when he had been cold to me. He apologized for the version of himself that had sorted people into categories of worth based on criteria that, as he put it, turned out to matter considerably less than I believed. He told me that watching me care for him had changed something in him and that he was sorry he had waited so long to say so. He also told me exactly what he had done. 18 months before he died, Thomas had gone to a separate attorney, not Donna Friel, who had always been the family attorney, whose loyalty lay where loyalties in such arrangements always lie, and had executed a new legal instrument, not a change to the primary will. A separate document entirely, a deed of gift and a trust structured in a specific way, witnessed and notarized, that conveyed to me a property I had not known he owned. A house in Yellow Springs. A small Victorian on Xenia Avenue that had belonged to his sister, who had died without children, and that had come to him 10 years ago and sat quietly in his name ever since. It had been rented out and the rental income had accumulated in a separate account. He had also designated that account just over $60,000 to me directly as a named beneficiary, structured so that it passed outside the estate entirely, beyond the reach of the will, beyond Donna Friel, beyond Richard and Carter and whatever they had decided around my dining room table while I was still standing at a graveside. The second thing in the envelope was a card, a small one, the kind you'd tuck into a flower arrangement. On the front, in that same careful handwriting, "You didn't have to, but you did." That's the whole of it. I called Andrea Marsh first thing the next morning. She reviewed the documents with a colleague who specialized in real property transfers. Everything was in order. The deed had been properly recorded with the county. The trust had been established through a legitimate firm in Columbus. Richard could contest it, Andrea told me, but he had little legal ground. The property had never been part of the marital estate. Thomas had owned it independently. He had disposed of it independently. That was his right. Richard did not take this quietly. He called me 7 times the day after Andrea sent her first letter. I let them go to voicemail. The messages shifted from confused to indignant to, by the 7th one, a tone I had heard before, over 21 years, the particular register Richard used when he had decided that he was the wronged party in a situation and needed the world to agree with him. I called Derek instead. He picked up on the second ring, which told me he had been waiting. We met for coffee at a place in Grandview, neutral ground. He looked like he hadn't slept. He was stirring his coffee long after it needed stirring and staring at the table, and when I sat down he said, "I didn't know they were going to do that. At the house. I want you to be clear on that." I told him I believed him. "My dad is," he stopped. Started again. "Dad has wanted things a certain way for a long time and Carter goes along with whatever he wants." I tried to say something before the will reading, and he told me to stay out of it. I asked him how he felt about what had happened. He looked up at me. I feel like you spent 16 years doing everything right, and everyone in my family took that for granted except Grandpa Thomas. And I feel like I should have said something a long time ago, and I didn't, and I don't know how to fix that. He was 26 years old, and he had driven 45 minutes to say that to me, unprompted. I told him that I appreciated it. I told him that what had happened at that dining room table was not his responsibility to fix, and that I wasn't going anywhere. I was still going to be in Ohio. I was still going to answer when he called, because whatever was happening between me and his father, Derek was still Derek. He looked at me with something that took me a moment to identify because I wasn't expecting it. Relief. He said, "I was scared you'd just disappear." I told him I didn't disappear. That wasn't something I did. I moved into the house in Yellow Springs on a Thursday in November. It needed work. Thomas had kept it rented and maintained, but not loved. The back garden had gone to weed, and the kitchen fixtures were 20 years old, and one of the porch steps had a soft spot that needed replacing. I am not by nature a person who requires things to be perfect before I begin to appreciate them, and by the first evening I had unpacked enough to find the good lamp from my own boxes and set it in the window of the front sitting room, and it felt, in a way I hadn't expected, like something settling. Patricia helped me move. Derek came the following weekend with his girlfriend, and they helped me with the garden beds, pulling out the dead growth from the summer so that there was something clean to start from in spring. We worked for most of the afternoon without talking very much, which is its own kind of good. Richard filed papers in December. His attorney argued several theories, none of which, according to Andrea, were particularly strong. We reached a formal separation agreement in the spring. I will not tell you it was painless, because 21 years is 21 years, and even a marriage that ends badly contains things that mattered. But I will tell you that I signed the paperwork on a clear March morning and then drove home to Yellow Springs and made dinner and ate it at my own table, and the quiet in the house felt like something I had earned. I went back to nursing, part-time, at a smaller clinic outside Dayton that focuses on elder care. It was not a difficult decision. The years I had spent with Thomas had reminded me why I had chosen this work in the first place, not the institution of it, not the paperwork and the schedules, but the actual human work of sitting with someone in difficulty and making sure they were not alone. I am 62 years old and I have good years of this left, and I intend to use them. My colleagues at the clinic know something of my story, the outline of it. One of the intake nurses told me, a few months in, that she was herself caring for a parent at home and struggling with all of it, the logistics, the exhaustion, the feeling of invisibility that comes with work nobody officially counts. I told her that the invisibility was the hardest part, not the exhaustion, which you can sleep off, the feeling that the work doesn't register. That you could be doing the most important thing in a household and have it treated as furniture, background, something that simply exists without anyone having built it. She asked me what I did about it. I thought about Thomas's envelope, the 4 pages of cream-colored stationery, the small card tucked behind it. "You find the one person who sees you clearly," I said. "Sometimes that takes longer than it should, but they're usually there." She nodded like she understood. Maybe she did. I am not going to tell you that everything resolved neatly, because it didn't. Life does not do that. Richard and I are legally separated, and the divorce will be final sometime this summer, and there are still moments driving past a restaurant we used to go to, hearing a song on the radio at the wrong time, when the weight of it lands on me unexpectedly, and I give it a moment, and then I keep moving. Derek and I have dinner once a month, usually in Columbus. Usually somewhere he picks because he has inherited his grandfather's opinions about restaurants. He is doing well. That matters to me more than I would have predicted. The house in Yellow Springs is mine in a way I don't have a fully adequate word for. Not just legally. I painted the kitchen in February. A color called antique linen, which is exactly what it sounds like, warm and a little worn and not trying to be something it isn't. I planted the back garden in April. Tomatoes, lavender, 2 kinds of basil, a climbing rose against the fence that won't do much this year but should be something in 2 or 3 summers. Thomas has been dead for 8 months. I think about him most mornings, briefly. The crossword on the table. The way he looked out at the yard in the afternoons. The particular quality of his voice that last time he handed me an envelope, careful, deliberate, meaning every syllable. I keep his card in the drawer by my bed. I don't take it out very often anymore. I don't need to. I remember what it says. You didn't have to, but you did. That's the whole of it. I used to think that the point of doing right by someone was the doing, the act itself, regardless of whether it was witnessed. And I still believe that, mostly. But I have learned something else since that October afternoon when I walked into my own home and found people I had fed and cared for sitting at my table dividing up what they thought was mine. The people who see you clearly, they exist. They are often quieter than the ones who don't. They often do their accounting in private, in their own time, in handwriting that takes effort. But they notice. That's the thing nobody tells you going in. They notice.